Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, to today's CA Single Sign-On Community Webcast. Today's session, How to Simplify Access for Single-Page Apps with OpenID Connect, is presented by Herb and Ravi from the Product Management team. A couple housekeeping notes. You can ask a question at any time using the Q&A. Just be sure to ask of everyone so we see it. The session will be recorded so that it's available to you later, probably in the next day or two up on the site. You should also receive an email with the information as well, a link to the recording. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to you, Herb.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chris. And just a sort of, again, the little parity check. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Great. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time out of your day here today. As Chris indicated, we're going to take you through some material here. And it'll be a little bit of a tag team between myself and Ravi, but let's get started. The agenda really is pretty straightforward. The brief commentary around single-page applications, and then we'll talk around elements of OpenID Connect that help support access management for single-page applications, and also indicate specific elements where capabilities within CASSO provide some expanded usability, expanded administrative capabilities, and improved cost associated with enabling and controlling access to single-page apps. So we're going to intend to do that. And then at the end, we've got a little bit of an additional set of information we hope you'll find useful. And that's the intent to achieve. Again, if there are questions that come up, I'll be sort of keeping an eye on the Q&A area and try to respond to those if they appear to fit in the real-time part of the commentary of the material, and if not, we'll try to take them at the end. So thank you for your time. Really simple commentary about single-page applications here. In essence, the single-page application is a web application. The thing that makes it different is application code is essentially loaded in a single page, and a lot of the control of what's displayed to the end user is driven by JavaScript and processing on the client side. And so the display basically can change without page reloads, and that results in the user experience being a smoother user experience, akin to what you might see in a desktop application, right? And any interaction that's necessary typically takes place in the background. And so again, the user's experience, the application appears a lot more dynamic. The nature of information and changes on the page can be very small in nature. And net result is, again, just an overall simpler, easier experience. But it does come with a certain set of changes in the nature of how the client-to-server communication process happens, how authorization and access happens to bits and pieces of data and information, with a lot of the administration, not so much administration, but a lot of the sort of change in the nature of what happens on the display taking place purely within the power of the client. So that's the backdrop of sort of single-page apps, and a little bit of the distinction and difference between what you might consider as traditional apps and how those interact on the web. And we know that, of course, over time, the implementation of these has grown dramatically, and with that, in parallel, obviously, the use of something like OpenID Connect in support of single-page apps has also been developed. And so we're going to talk and switch gears here from talking about the concept of the single-page app really to more of the detail around how OpenID Connect works in conjunction with single-page app, and again, how some characteristics and capabilities within CASSO provide enhanced ability to manage that access. So With that, I'll turn it over to Ravi, who will talk in a little bit more detail before he swings it back to me. And Ravi, when you need the screen advanced, just let me know.
Thanks, Herb. In next few slides, I will cover how CASSO OIDC provider enables the authentication flows for single-page applications with various configuration options, and how CASSO provides the ability to the organization to control the authentication levels to improve the security for sensitive applications. And also I will cover the feature like user attribute mapping, which helps to reduce the cost in managing user schema in user stores in order to address the various requirements from various single-page applications. So this particular slide explains the interaction between single-page application and CASSO OIDC provider from various steps that starts from authentication request, token generation, token validation, and token revocation. So the single-page application, which requires a token from OIDC provider once the user is authenticated by CASSO OIDC provider. So same token can be propagated to the resource server to display content to the user after that resource server validates the token with the OIDC provider. So in order to handle all these steps, CASSO OIDC provider supports various OIDC endpoints like authorization endpoint, user info endpoint, introspection endpoint, and revocation endpoint. Apart from these, token endpoint and JWK endpoints are also available in the product, which are not displayed in this particular flow diagram in order to make it very clear about the purpose of implicit flow for single-page applications. So to start and to explain the flow diagram, now the user is trying to access a single-page application. So SPA redirects the request to the authorization endpoint, and once the user is authenticated by CASSO OIDC provider, token is generated and responded back to the browser. So after step 1, SPA holds the access token at the browser level, and SPA sends the same token to the resource server in step 2 to get the REST API or the response from that particular resource server in order to get the response and to display the content into the page for the user. So the resource server needs to validate that particular token is valid or not, and whatever the scope is available with the token. So in order to validate all those details, resource server can send the details to the introspection endpoint of OIDC provider, and it can get the meta info of the access token details. Once the token is valid and once the scope is determined by the resource server, then it can give the response back to the single page application with the required content for that particular user. So the single page application can get user information from OIDC provider using user info endpoint if it requires any other additional attributes, user attributes from the user info endpoint. And at the same time, this SPA can send a request to the revoke endpoint to deactivate the token from the provider as well. Can you advance the slide, please? So let us get into the purpose of authorization code flow and implicit flow and how to decide the flows appropriately for different type of application. So the first one is the authorization code flow. In general, two types of applications are defined by the OIDC specifications, which are public and confidential. Public application is the one which is consumer-based application or the application which is accessed outside of network. So the client credentials like client secret is not shared with the public client application. However, confidential client application requires to be authenticated with client credentials. Hence, the authorization code flow is required for confidential client application. So to keep the tokens more secure, to avoid the security breaches, tokens can be retrieved using back-channel communication. And generally, the access token is considered as short-lived and refresh token is a long-lived token. So the refresh token is possible with the authorization code flows. And also, the tokens are not revealed to the user agent as they are retrieved from the endpoints. So with all the above semantics, authorization code flow is generally used for high-sensitive applications, high-sensitive web applications particularly. Whereas, implicit flow generally recommended for the applications which are browser-based and using a scripting language. And the applications, those need to avoid the back-channel communication to get the tokens. At the same time, public applications does not hold the client secret to be authenticated by the provider. In such cases, generally the single page applications requires the implicit flow. And access and ID tokens are available at the browser level, and those tokens can be used to identify user details and scope at the application level as such. So the implicit flow is executed in one round trip, which gives a quick authentication experience to the user for single page applications. So the left-hand side, the flow diagram clearly explains the how we can take a judgment about for which applications we can use implicit and for which applications we can use the authorization code flow. The general guidelines is for the client is public, and if the client is spa, we can go ahead with the implicit flow. If the client is not the public, that means if it is a confidential, go with the authorization code flow. This is the general guideline. Ed, can you please move a slide, please? Yeah, this is a sample request and response format of implicit flow. So the first sample request is the client application is expecting both ID token and the token. So here the token means the access token, and ID token consists of authentication events, and at the same time user info also can be part of the ID token. So if you can notice that response has the details about ID token and access token as the parameters in the response from the authorization code. The second sample request, the response type is ID token. That means it is not expecting the access token from the ODC provider. In such cases, the single page application can use the ID token to authenticate the user, to give the access to that specific users on the resources. Ed, can you advance the slide, please? Yeah. Can you move back a little bit, one slide back?
So just sorry, yeah, it just wants to jump on me. Hang on a second.
Nice.
It's a quick jump.
Yeah. So apart from the ODC standard flow supporting the product, CASSO is providing step-up authentication capability, which allows the organization to decide required authentication levels for different applications and to control the strength of authentication as well. ODC relying parties can request specific authentication context that would be applied by provider to authenticate the user. And provider can give the communication back to the relying parties where the requested authentication context was used or not. So the relying parties can decide higher authentication levels for more sensitive applications. So that gives the higher level confidence to the organization, and at the same time users will get challenged whenever they are trying to use the higher sensitive applications. With the step-up authentications, user can be authenticated again as a result of comparing requested authentication level and existing authentication level if the session is already exist, even if the session is already exist as well. So authentication context request, that is as part of the ODC standard, that would be maintained to authentication levels in ODC provider, and this ACR value is part of the authentication request. So SSO provider, ODC provider will validate the authentication context request in order to challenge the user again in case if the existing authentication is already minimum when compared with the requested authentication level. So in this particular flow diagram, to give an example, if the user is trying to access first application with level 5, because this is the first request, SSO ODC provider challenge the user and the token will be generated with level 5. And if the user is trying to access another application which is at the level 10, so the new ACR will come into the request. So SSO ODC provider validates that particular ACR value, and then the existing level, that is 5, is lesser than the requested level 10, so it will challenge the user again. The third access, so if the user is trying to access the third application, which is at level 8, then SSO ODC provider will compare the existing access level, that is nothing but 10, and the requested authentication level is 8, hence the user will not get challenged. So it's a seamless login experience to the user whenever he is trying to access the applications which are required the lower authentication levels. Head slide. Yep, thanks. Sorry. This slide and next slide explains how to configure step-up authentication in the SSO OIDC provider. In OIDC provider section, minimum authentication level can be defined, and that is treated as the default authentication mode. So this minimum authentication level should be equal or greater than the authentication level at the authentication scheme. So this minimum authentication level is used during the generation of the authorization code. So if you notice, this minimum authentication level is the 5. So if you configure authentication level at the authentication scheme, that should be either 5 or less than that. And please consider that enable dynamic authentication mode checkbox. So if we will enable the dynamic authentication mode, that will enable the authentication context class reference behavior in the product. That is nothing but dynamic authentication mode. Okay, next slide please. So this slide explains how to configure ACR and authentication level with the authentication URLs details. This ACR section is visible and enabled only if dynamic authentication mode is selected, which I already explained in the previous slide. In this example, particular configuration, 2 ACRs are defined with authentication level ranges between 5 and 500 and 501 2000 with 2 different authentication URLs. One is redirect.jsp and other one is the redirect10.jsp. But one authentication context URL is considered as a default. So all these configurations can be done in the OIDC provider section. So during the runtime, if any authentication request with ACR value silver is coming, SSO OIDC provider uses the specific authentication URL, in this case redirect.jsp, and set the authentication level configured in the authentication scheme. So if the second request comes with ACR value as a gold, SSO OIDC provider checks the existing authentication level, and the requested authentication level is higher than the existing authentication level. So SSO challenges the user for authentication again and protect higher sensitive resources even if the session already exists. So these are the 2 sections which are available with the OIDC provider to configure the default authentication mode with the minimum authentication level configuration and the dynamic authentication mode that is configured with the authentication context class references. Ed, can you move next slide please? Yeah. Introspection endpoint. This is a standard endpoint defined by OIDC. So this enables more robust authorization capability for both resource server and the OIDC provider. So I will explain how the behavior of introspection endpoint in case of resource server is trying to communicate with the OIDC provider. So if you have an existing token, before granting access to that user, so the resource server to get an information about the meta details about that particular token, like when the particular user was authenticated, what is the validity of that specific access token, and what are the scope is associated with that specific access token. All these details can be retrieved from the OIDC provider introspection endpoint. This information is very critical for resource servers in order to give access on protected resources. SSO OIDC provider gives the details about the scope and state of the access and refresh tokens as we displayed in this particular snippet. So if you notice, the request contains the authorization basic header along with the token. So this introspection endpoint supports both access token and refresh token. However, the refresh token behavior is not applicable for the implicit flow. But if the resource server sends a request with the token equal to some value, SSO OIDC provider validates the token validity and give this particular status as true or false. And then it gives a response back with the what are the scopes associated with that specific access token. And also it can give the details about the user, for which user this token is granted. And also it can provide the details about when the ID token was issued and what is the expiry of this particular access token. Yes, can you please move the slide? And this particular slide talks about the user attribute mapping. This is another major capability in the OIDC provider as a differentiator to lower the cost of implementing or managing the heterogeneous user repositories to address the requirement from various single-page applications in our organization. So if you have multiple single-page applications and that may require user client data in different format, or may expect the user claims from different user repositories as well. In all these cases, user attribute mapping can be configured in ODC provider, and that user information can be propagated to the client application in much easier way. So SSO ODC provider has ability to define the single logical attribute to source the conceptual attribute, which is stored in various heterogeneous user repositories to address the requirement from client application. For example, if you have multiple applications, one application can expect user attribute in a different format. Application 2 expects the same attribute in a different format. I will explain the use cases and examples in the next slide. So the user attribute mapping supports various types of logical patterns such as alias, constant, group, mask, and expressions to address various requirements of your client applications. And user attribute mapping is defined at the CSSO wide. And overall, the major benefit in using user attribute mapping is to reduce the cost of finding and using user attributes in the application level. So it helps to avoid the change in schema data in the user repository. So that behavior you can achieve with the user attribute mapping in the ODC provider section. Yep. Advance the slide, please. Yeah. This is the first example which is related to the user attribute mapping. And this slide explains the simple use case of two single-page applications requirement of getting date of birth in different formats. One is in expecting DD MMRA format, and other one is expecting month DD year format. And these particular two applications are expecting these two clients from ODC provider as part of user info response. To address the above requirement, and configuration is very straightforward in user attribute mapping section as in the below snippet. So user attribute mapping supports 5 logical attribute patterns. For this use case, I selected this particular expression format. If you notice, we are given like date of DD and MMYY format. And the same way, another attribute mapping can be defined with a different expression for the same user attribute. So in ODC provider section, if you observe the right-hand snippet, this is the section from the ODC provider where you can create the claims with these two logical attributes. So during the runtime, the user info response will try to capture the values from DOD_app1 from the expression, given expression in that particular user attribute mapping. And for the DOB_app2, it will try to capture the expression, related expression from the user attribute mapping. And the values will be responded back to the client application using the user info REST endpoint. Yes? Can you advance the slide, please? This is the second example related to the user attribute mapping. In this example, POV1 need an attribute sort name in the format of last name, first name in order to display the content in sorting order. So user information is split across multiple user repositories in the organization. I'm just taking a use case like how the user information is split across multiple user repositories in the organization. So the repository A does not have a sort name attribute, but it does have separate attributes like first name and last name. Similarly, repository B does not have sort name attribute, but there are two separate attributes like U_last name and U_first name. Those are available in the user store. So usually this requires managing the backend schema in the user repositories to handle specific format of attributes in order to handle the requirement from this particular single page application. But with the pattern expression of user attribute mapping, the required behavior can be achieved very easily. You can create a common claim using the expression to fetch the attributes from repository A and repository B. With this capability, you can also reduce the application level logic to convert the user attributes. So the behavior can be implemented or the behavior can be achieved in the ODC level itself instead of handling that at the application level. And at the same time, the other benefit would be you will be able to handle the attribute conversions in the ODC provider level rather than to manage all those conversions in the repositories level. So these are the 4 main capabilities I intended to cover for single-page application scenarios, and particularly the benefits of using step-up and user attribute mapping features to enable higher security level and to reduce the load in managing user repository schemas are the highly beneficial for single-page applications. I'm handing over to Herb to cover the next coming slides. Herb.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ravi, for that. I appreciate that. I think one of the points we wanted to make in relationship to OpenID Connect is, and again, the focus here I think has been on single-page applications, but we also wanted to sort of round up OpenID Connect as a capability within CASSO using this slide, which is intended to communicate that there are a number of different applications and resources across a whole range of different styles of applications within your environment. You know, some of them are local to you, some of them are remote, whether they're SaaS apps or partner-based apps. And OpenID Connect, in our view, is simply another tool for enabling your ability to control that access. What Ravi covered, if you go back and we think about it just for a second, is, you know, the step-up authentication and the authentication context capability allows you to take advantage of all of the authentication methods within CASSO, and to use CASSO as a tool to help ensure the level of security for authentication to access those environments. And so that's an element of strength that results from the combination of OpenID Connect with the CASSO functionality. The introspection endpoint commentary really is something that's consistent with the standard and is something that doesn't necessarily have any specific differentiation related to CASSO. But when we get into attribute mapping, that is a functionality today where if you've used CASSO and its more long-standing sort of web access management usage pattern, attribute mapping, user attribute mapping has been part of the product, such that you can create this concept of a logical variable to be used within policies and other functions of CASSO. And what we do is we've extended the support of that sort of unique capability into its use in conjunction with OpenID Connect. So right, the sort of the sample of those 3 areas to communicate around CASSO, its OpenID Connect functionality, and also in relationship to single-page apps are sort of a subset of the capabilities within the product, but they're ones that we think are relevant both from a security perspective, from an ease and breadth of capabilities around validation, scope, and authorization, and as well in relationship to enabling more easily the use of OpenID Connect in an organization that has user information spread across heterogeneous repositories that's necessary for interacting with the single-page app. So we wanted to share those things, but we wanted to put it in the context of OpenID Connect is simply another tool sort of in the CASSO capability set, and in sort of the choice of which tool to use in conjunction with which application is really something that you have flexibility to make multiple choices from in order to get the best result for your organization and for controlling access, whether the resource and the application is on premise, whether it's at a partner site, whether it's based on an application that you want to be exposed and interact with CASSO just on its authentication authorization capability through a REST interface, or whether it's a SaaS-based application. So again, the value here is the the net result is the use of CASSO across a range of application types through a single pattern of activity. Other things that we wanted to share with you as a result of getting together here, there are a range of other sources of information recently provided that, again, we highlight here, and if you want to take a look at these and dig in a little bit more deeply outside of the OpenID Connect and single-page app summary that we had here today, here are a range of additional webinars that we've executed recently around agentless access management, and certainly the use of OpenID Connect falls into that space as well. I know we mentioned it in that webinar, again, digging in a little bit more deeply in relationship to single-page apps here and some of the functionality specifically related to OpenID Connect. And then other areas that we've mentioned and some partner webinars we've done recently as well, so we hope you take advantage of those. Another sort of final extra credit kind of a set of information we wanted to share, because sometimes these things get done and delivered, but they aren't completely visible to everybody. We've provided a set of information around how to integrate using, again, OpenID Connect with Amazon, Alexa, and the Echo devices for providing the ability to have a voice-driven interaction with an Echo device to gain access to information protected by CASSO, with the underpinning technology being used there is around OpenID Connect. We've offered additional guidance for deployment in AWS and Azure in our technical information, and we've published on GitHub Ansible playbook associated with installing CASSO. So those latter two items are a little bit outside the scope of OpenID Connect, but again, in the interest of sharing some of this information more broadly, we hope that you'll find and be able to take advantage of those. And then finally, we mentioned a number of things related to OpenID Connect here on this in this webinar, but there's more development work going on in that space, and some of it will be obviously applicable to single-page apps. Some of it will be applicable to other elements and capabilities and areas around OpenID Connect. And if there's interest in seeing the progress around that, this is essentially how you would see that. There's a site, validate.ca.com, which is open, and available on an ongoing basis. And if you go to that site, you can find the CA Single Sign-On Customer Validation Project. And if you enroll in that, then you'll be able to also participate and see additional work going on that front. So that sort of brings to a close the nature of the prepared comments associated with this. And there are a couple of questions in the Q&A tab. So we'd like to take those questions and see if we can provide some help and commentary in response to them. And then we'll open it for further questions that can be done audio-wise. So let me tee up these questions. Ravi, you and I can collaborate on responding to these. Question number one is, in stateless implementation approach, how is session management done in CASSO? So, Ravi, if you want to take a shot at that initially, I'll also add to it and see if we can provide some commentary on that. Ravi, are you on mute?
Yep. So as a ODC provider, once the authorization code is generated, and token will be handed over to the relying party. So the same token can be used for further communication whenever they want to give access on some other applications as well. As such, the sessions will not be maintained further once the particular session is closed. But for whenever you are using refresh token behavior, that is a long-lived token, and client application can use that refresh token, can get a new access token from ODC provider.
Yeah, and I'll add to that because I think there is a broader context here for session management. So one thing's for sure is that tokens are generated and they have a duration to them. And so sort of the nature of this being a stateless, certainly in the use of the implicit flow, there's a very stateless nature to things. But, tokens have a duration associated with them. So sort of the real only basic session management, frankly, that you do have at its most fundamental implementation is based on the duration of the token and the fact that the OpenID client can call back to the introspection endpoint to determine the validity of the existing token. So there's a little bit of control there, not as much as you might have with something like SM session, but nonetheless, there's a little bit there. The second element to state there is a session management profile that's associated with OpenID Connect, and we expect to do more work down that path as well. I think, again, fundamentally, there's a nature of a cooperation that has to obviously take place between the OIDC client and the OIDC provider in relationship to session management. So there are some certainly going to be some differences in terms of overall session management related to when you compare things like OpenID Connect and SM Session and SAML, but hopefully that gives you a little bit of information in relationship to elements around session management and some of the basic parts of, or the basic configuration of OpenID Connect. Second question was, what is the best practice CA suggests on storing the tokens on the client single-page app slide? And I'm not sure I have a great answer for that. I'd actually probably defer this to other folks who are in the app development side on single-page apps. But go ahead, Ravi, you have a comment
I have a comment on top of that. So there is a specification around the best practices for the single-page applications and native mobile applications, how to manage the tokens that is defined by the OIDC.
And is there a specific pointer where one could find that, Ravi?
Yeah, we can share that information.
Okay, great, thanks. Let's see, we've got a few more that have come in. Let me see if I can get to the next one. Let's see. Does this flow remove enforcement away from, sorry, I'm scrolling down, SiteMinder agents and more to the application, scrolling. Does the application team now need to enforce security correctly, is the question. And the answer is yes. I mean, in large measure, think of what CASSO is doing here in acting as an OIDC provider, right? We're providing a token which grants the OpenID client access to information. The resource server also has a role to play in making sure it's only providing the right resources associated with the scope. OpenID, CASSO as a provider is delivering scope information as well, and we're delivering identity data. So, again, there's a little bit of a cooperation element that has to go on between OpenID, CASSO as a provider and the client. The scope is a key element. If CASSO is configured to deliver a very broad scope in the access token, then the access token has the ability to enable access to an awful lot of information. So, some of the control of access can certainly be constrained by having narrower scope within the access token. But the application has a key role to play also in how to enforce security. Ravi, comments on that?
That's all. That's fine, sir. Yeah. No
wow, I hit one well. Thank you. Okay. Let's see. The next one is, and I'm not sure I'm getting these all in the right order, but is single-page app integration with CASSO. I'm swapping out the SiteMinder name for its current name. Sorry, but I have to do that. Is a single-page app integration with SiteMinder, can it be achieved only via the OpenID Connect mechanism? Interesting question. My general belief is that there is another way to achieve that, in the sense that single-page apps, in broad measure, are JavaScript-oriented primarily. You could, without using OpenID Connect, you could have a JavaScript-based application call the CASSO REST interface that can support a JavaScript implementation directly. You can do that without using OpenID Connect. So there is a mechanism for doing it, but I think the sort of, if you will, the standard-based way for achieving that integration is to use something like OpenID Connect, because otherwise, your single-page app is going to be making a call to SSO directly, and there are some elements of how you do the configuration around granting access, which are sort of specific and unique to the way CASSO functions, and not 100% consistent with OpenID Connect. So there are two methods here, and you can do it by having the single-page app call CASSO's exposed REST interface for authentication authorization. But the nice thing that OpenID Connect provides is sort of a consistent way in which that interaction will work. Any other comments on that one, Ravi?
Yep. The main, you covered everything, but one additional comment would be the interactions between the resource server and OIDC provider is the key over here. So the single-page applications which will try to fetch the information from multiple REST APIs or from the multiple resource servers, then the token can be propagated very easily from the single-page applications, which is the token is sitting in the browser level, that can go to the resource server, and resource server can validate that access token with the OIDC provider. Hence, the OIDC is the recommended. Even in the web also, everyone is saying like the OIDC is the right fit for the single-page authentications.
Yeah, good point. If the single-page app needs to grab data from a variety of different sources, OpenID Connect is going to provide a better mechanism to achieve that. I agree. Absolutely right. Next one is an SM session cookie also generated after OIDC authentication. But I think this is a little bit inverted. I think the basic flow goes along these lines: is that an authentication happens. And I think really the net result here is my reading of the question is a little bit off, but I think what you're basically asking is, hey, an authentication happens, an OpenID Connect token is generated. The question is, an SM session cookie also generated associated with that authentication event? I think that's the base question that is coming up. And I don't know, I know with JOT tokens, we have an ability to, or JOT authentication, we have an ability to turn off the generation of SM session, but I'm not certain off the top of my head right now, and I'd have to go look at this as to whether or not, if an authentication is happening in support of an OpenID Connect token generation, if an SM session cookie is also generated. That I don't know off the top of my head. Do you know, Ravi?
I believe like SM session cookie will be generated during the authorization code flow. But if the request comes to the authorization code flow, then the SM session cookie will also be generated. But further communication between the token endpoints, the SM session cookie will not be available. So those are the backend calls.
Yeah, so I think the base answer is at that initial authentication, SM session is generated, but for all of that other interaction that you saw in some of the connection points that Ravi had on a slide related to connecting to end user info, connecting to introspection, endpoint, et cetera, SM Sessions not used in any of those.
Yep.
Okay. There's a question here that says, is it not possible using traditional approach? I'm not sure exactly what that question is related to, but I think it goes back to, is SPA integration with CASSO, can it be achieved only OIDC mechanism? And again, the answer is no. If you have a relatively simple single-page application, again, you could connect it to CASSO for authentication authorization decisions based on the ability for that single-page app to make a REST call to CASSO for authentication authorization. So there is an ability to do that. It's done through the Access Gateway, where there is an exposed interface, REST-based interface, that can accept, JSON over XML, but if you have a single-page app that's doing perhaps multiple things and needs to go get data from perhaps multiple resource servers, that's more of an OpenID Connect flow, and you're going to want to use OIDC for that. Any plans to make feature available to put access token and refresh token in JOT with encrypted payload? Hang on, there's a longer question, so I've got to scroll down. For security-minded organizations, stateless implementation on top of PKCE and POP. So general answer to the question, again, this is not necessarily meant to be a roadmap presentation, but the general answer to the question is yes, and stay tuned for that. For browser-based SPAs, is local storage recommended to store the token? I think I would, again, go back to the recommendation summary that Ravi referred to. I'm not sure, Chris, we may need some help. And maybe this is a community-based webinar, so I think we could probably place the answer to that question next to the recording so that people could gain access to the pointer that we have for the best practices. So I think that's what we'll do. That's probably the best way to do it. Let's see. Will this recorded session be made available? And the answer to that is yes. And typically, Chris, it's like a 24-hour turnaround before it's posted. Is that about right?
We'll have it posted by the end of the week.
Okay, a good deal. This is Thursday. That's Friday, so roughly, before the end of the week, we should have it posted, and hopefully that will be useful. Any other questions that people want to type in, they can. If we want to, I think we can take some through the audio process. I think it's #6 to unmute your line if you'd like to ask a question. Okay. No other questions?
It does look like one more came in the Q&A.
Oops, sorry. Got to keep scrolling. Where can I find the recording session? That'll be posted at the community site.
There's one after that.
And within the community site, though, Chris, there are a couple of different dimensions, right? There's the ideas section, the document section, this section, that section. Where does the recording get posted? There are a couple of different categories. If you go to the community site, you've got that string of icons across the top that give you access to different sets.
Yeah, so it'll be posted in the video section, and everybody who attends today will also get an email with a link to the recording as well.
Yeah, thanks. Okay. Plans to make future available to consume the encrypted payload and an ID token for JWT auth scheme. If so, how soon? Again, this is not really the venue in which I can give specifics around timelines associated with futures. So what I'd suggest for the individual asking the question is, connect with me in a way that we can have that conversation under a little bit of a non-disclosure structure, and we can spend more time answering that. So we're happy to do so. But again, this venue, I'm not really able to speak about futures in such a way. Okay. I think that's what I see. Okay. If there are no further questions, thank you everybody for your time. I do appreciate you taking the time out. There's a lot more depth to aspects of capabilities within the product related to OpenID Connect. We chose a couple of areas that we thought would be valuable around authentication, authorization, and sort of this uniqueness around organizations that have heterogeneous schemas in different user repositories, but want to make the connection and implementation of OIDC simpler. So we chose those specifically, but again, there's a range of other capabilities. We encourage you to take a look at some of the technical information on the most recent release, and also encourage you to look at the validation site in relationship to other work that will be progressing around OpenID Connect as one of the topics that you'll see there. Back to you, Chris. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Ravi and Herb, for presenting today. Thank you, everyone, for participating, and wishing everybody a great rest of your day.